So just to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We're delighted to have you join us again. The panels yesterday were fantastic, and I look forward to the conversation continuing. I'll turn it over to Jack in just a second. I wanted to take a moment to pull out a few of the themes or the questions that I thought ran through yesterday and will continue to do so today, but just to highlight a few of them. And there were many more, so I won't go on and on. This will give people a chance to come into the meeting as well. One of the first questions that I thought was so powerfully put is really, why is the plantation form, the imaginary, the set of practices, the production sort of industry, why is it so enduring over time and over space? Even when, as Tanya Lee said, they're not necessarily the most efficient or the most profitable, even from a pure, financial standpoint in terms of productivity, right? Why does the plantation form have this incredible enduring power? And she says to follow the money, but she's not talking necessarily about the harvest or the crop per se, but from the whole apparatus that is promoting and supporting and really invested in the continuation of plantation production. I thought that was very powerfully put. A second theme or thought that came up from the panels was that plantations are, of course, racialized. So not only the legacy of the sort of beginning of plantations, maybe through the colonial era, but even before, but also in their ongoing labor and ownership dynamics. So they're racialized, but Catherine McKittrick really urges us to think about how they are articulated, but also that race and plantations are not twinned, so they are not the same thing, and how do we hold them together, race and the plantation form, while also holding them analytically distinct, as Nancy Peluso urged us to do. The third theme I thought that came up, or that we might want to continue thinking about, is how do we follow plantation legacies in thinking about something as broad as the Plantationocene, even when a specific set of plantations don't materialize, right? And so this was Eugen and Euclides. How do we think about sort of the aspirations and the detritus of those and of the projects? The fourth one was, of course, how do we analytically and historically, theoretically make sense of the very different histories of labor. And so many people put forward quite interesting and very different stories of the connection of laborers within plantation societies. How do we think about those different forms of labor while understanding whether there are patterns or similarities, and also centering the relationship between land and labor, not thinking of those as somehow fundamentally distinct, even when we're talking not about ownership, but about labor. And fifth, fascinating, also, of course, deeply problematic or chilling, I think was the word that I used, thinking about the practices of calculation, right, used to determine the value of labor and of the land. How do we think about those practices over time? So from Caitlin Rosenthal's presentation on calculations of the value of a slave hand, an enslaved person, to thinking about plantation values today. And finally, of course, there were a number of questions in the chat and also in the conversations that people presented about the implications for alternatives. What are the strategies for not only thinking in individual places or specific areas about alternatives, but what are the broader elements for political organizing? So they were fantastic panels. I thank all of the panelists yesterday and today. In this first panel, we're missing João Mosca. He was called into the finance ministry at the last minute in Maputo for a meeting about COVID in rural Mozambique. And so we wish him good luck and strength in those conversations. His organization, the Rural Observatory of Mozambique, is doing some of the best work on the political economy of agriculture and agrarian politics in Mozambique. And so we'll follow up with him another time. So now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jack. Jack Zinda is chairing this panel 3. He's a colleague of mine, a faculty member here in the Department of Global Development. His work is fantastic. He does socio-ecological analysis of, I think, agronomic practices and beliefs. He would probably correct me or make it more sophisticated. Agronomic practices and beliefs in rural China and increasingly in the US. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I'm really gratified again to welcome everybody to our third panel and conversations on the plantation scene, plantations and smallholders, relationships and resistance. The plantation scene has brought successive waves of commodity booms and land grabs. Smallholders have been dispossessed. In other situations, they've been incorporated as contract growers or joined cash crop rushes as independent producers. Of course, the relationships here depend on how we define the term plantation, but that's open for conversation. In any case, in each of these kinds of situations, we see reconfigurations of livelihoods, communities, political ecologies. And these changes, these situations elicit varied forms of negotiation, participation, and resistance. I'm really excited about this panel, whose participants are going to draw us into a conversation about smallholders' varied engagements with the plantation form. First, we have Jun Borras, professor of agrarian studies at the Institute of Social Studies, and his colleague Jennifer Franco, researcher at the Transnational Institute at Amsterdam, and they're going to explore how plantations expose the issue of labor justice and take an objective appraisal of workers' issues against the more dominant agrarian movement narratives and political projects. After them, we have Diya Dutta, a researcher with Oxfam in America and Oxfam Great Britain, who will consider the issue of land and worker rights in plantation contexts, synthesizing and distilling key findings from Oxfam America on the 4 challenges and efforts to address them with organizational programming. Following her, we'll have Carla Gras, researcher at the University of Buenos Aires, who will talk about her work in the Chaco region of Argentina, taking up questions around social differentiation, dispossession, and exclusion. Next, we'll have Shalmali Guttal, Executive Director of Focus on the Global South in Bangkok, who will apply the plantation scene concept to food systems, discussing how corporations are attempting to capture diverse food systems and make them uniform through technologies of production, storage, and distribution, and through control over global governance of food systems. As Wendy noted, we do not have João Mosca with us today. We're really sad about his absence. And we'll be closing with Prabhu Pingali, professor of applied economics and management at Cornell, who will discuss the transition from plantation-based export-oriented agricultural systems to small farm-based or aggregation models, considering whether farm-based cooperatives have been able to achieve economies of scale and reduce transaction costs of market participation in high-value crop production. You are welcome through the course of these presentations to post questions in the chat, and when all the presentations are complete, I'll facilitate the question and answer session afterwards. And with that, I'll cede the floor to Professor Borras.
All right, thank you for having me here. We prepared a speaking note just for the interest of time, so it's a little bit boring to read, but I'll do that so that I don't miss a point and while remaining in time. Okay, our intervention focuses on a very small part of Wendy's paper, namely on political struggles and resistance. In our intervention, we refer to a much narrower type of plantation. Here, we refer only to big capital in direct control over spheres of production, circulation, and consumption of agro-food commodities. This is whether the control is by landed class, agribusiness, or merchant comprador class, employing modern technologies, machines, chemicals, and physical and financial infrastructure. The setting is in a generalized commodification of land and labor, producing through monoculture in a bounded space. We only refer to contemporary plantations as well, many of which were outcomes of recent and ongoing global land rush. So we are referring to a very relatively small but significant section of the agrarian world. We take up from Wendy's point about transcending conventional rural-urban agriculture industry divides, both politically and in terms of academic research. We add another key divide between workers and peasants, as well as their politics, that is between labor justice and agrarian justice. These are old issues in critical agrarian studies. What we will try to do is to resurrect this old topic, and given the new wave of plantation making in the current conjuncture, try to come up with some propositions for further conversations, both politically and in terms of scholar activist research. So here are some few points for further conversations. First, politically, the focus of organizing and mobilizations has been on the framework of struggles against plantations. There is far less organized political work in struggles within plantations. Even far less common are instances of struggles within and against plantations. Struggles against plantations are occupying an important part of contemporary agrarian justice struggles. Struggles within plantations, when they occur, are framed within labor justice perspectives if it is within a wage work relations or around improvement of the terms of production contracts where these involve contracted owner cultivators. Where any of these types of struggle unfolds, it usually occurs at the local plantation level. Very rarely does it occur at the national or global level. Academic research tends to follow this trend in politics. Second point. Our main point is that if the current wave of plantation making today is part of the evolving neoliberal global capitalism, then struggles against and within capitalism have to gain ground in plantations. If this is so, political struggles cannot be framed as struggles within plantations or struggles against plantations. Or it cannot be framed either as struggles within plantations versus struggles against plantations, those binaries and the dichotomies. For us, it is not an either-or questions. Rather, both types of struggles are key. Therefore, the more important form of struggle should be struggles within and against plantations. It inherently goes beyond the labor justice and agrarian justice divide, as well as the short-term and long-term perspectives in social justice. But it is this latter type of struggles that are very, very rare today in any plantation settings, or at least in plantation settings that I know about. Third point, in many places, plantations were outcomes of fiercely contested land grabs, where as a result, companies are wary of recruiting hostile local labor force who felt coercively expelled from the land, or that local villagers are not willing to legitimize the land grabs by working for the land grabbers. The outcome today, as it has always been historically, is that the common practice of hiring of migrant labor becomes much more common. Others were put in political, economic, institutional, and spatial situation that forced them to get into a variety of contractual arrangement with big capital, resulting effectively in a plantation-like situation. Vast monoculture, based on owner-cultivator farms, where social life is organized largely in and around the contract, where farmers are completely dependent on big capital for input and output markets and for their social reproduction needs, especially in between harvests. Fourth point, the situation is made possible by and/or has resulted from the increasing number of people who needed to combine a range of productive and social reproductive activities in order to survive. They farm, they engage in seasonal wage work, they pursue strict petty commodity peddling, or others even engage in lumpen activities. They are the classes of labor according to Henry Bernstein, or working people according to Shidji, others. The difficulties and contradictions in political struggles are plenty. Villagers who were expelled from the land taken over by the plantations recruit allies to launch political struggles against plantations. Wage workers may struggle for better wages and working conditions. Contracted owner cultivators may struggle to improve the terms of their contract. Depending on their structural position, as well as on their calculation of their productive and social reproductive interests, they may or may not engage in overt, structured, and organized forms of contention. What each set decides to do is relational to the others across these three subcategories, objectively and subjectively. And companies and the state are notorious for prying further the cleavages among the various social groups and of working people to divide and rule. Fifth, it's very difficult to organize migrant seasonal labor within plantations. It is equally very difficult to organize scattered individual contracted owner cultivators within contract farming schemes. And it is difficult to organize villagers who were expelled by land grabs. At times when you are able to organize them, the highest form of demands that they would put forward is compensation, the terms of their expulsion, that is. Even more difficult is to organize the three social categories simultaneously and in an interlinked manner. Sixth point, it is thus important to closely consider the character of demands by plantation workers, whether regular wage workers or migrant seasonal workers, contracted owner cultivators, or previously expelled villagers, as well as their allies, objective and subjective allies, around the plantation setup in relation to the capacity of the plantation owners to give concessions to such demands, whether directly or through the intercession of the state via public policies on labor, taxation, and others. This reminds us more about the framing, the schema by Jeffrey Page, for instance, if some of you would recall. Doing so will give us a better and more systematic idea about the autonomy and capacity of plantation workers or contracted peasants to form organizations that can represent their class and other social interests and pursue them through the struggles. Second to the last point, the idea that in the long term plantations have to go and that another production system is possible is not utopian. Because indeed, in the era of jobless, hyper-economic growth, neoliberal global capitalism, and climate change, plantations do not and cannot represent a positive future. Thus, struggles against plantations will be a core component of any political struggle against capitalism. However, in the here and now, and in the short term, There are objective class relations and class conflict within plantations between owners of capital and working people that need to be fought within plantations. Now, our last point. It is not a matter of choosing whether it should be political struggles against or political struggles within plantations. That is important. It is both. The key challenge is to combine these political struggles, and it rarely happens, and that's the problem. The anti-capitalist struggles typology put forward by Eric Olin Wright in his posthumous book, 2020, is quite useful here. He identified 4 ideal types: smashing capitalism, taming capitalism, resisting capitalism, escaping capitalism. We can always substitute it with a smashing plantation, taming plantation, resisting plantation, escaping plantation. Same logic. The challenge, according to him, is not to identify which of the 4 is correct and most potent. For him, the challenge rather is how to combine them. It is the combination of political struggles that ought to be the main unit of political intervention. That's our main point. It is the combination of these different political struggles that ought to be the main unit of political interventions, as it ought to be the main unit of academic research. It is, of course, easier said than done. I end there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Borras. Next, we have Dr. Diya Dutta.
Thanks, Jack, for the introductions. A very good morning, good afternoon, and evening to all friends who joined from all over the world for this webinar. On behalf of Oxfam, I'm presenting our work on plantation economy and how we are trying through different ways to disrupt the exploitative plantation economy logic by working towards fair, sustainable, just methods which are enshrined in human rights. I am also going to be reading from prepared notes in the interest of time. So apologies if it sounds a little monotonous, but I'll try and be as less boring as possible. Over the past 3 decades, Oxfam has partnered and worked in coalition to tackle both the right to food and the right to dignity for all people. Our work with partners globally has predominantly focused on tackling the structural inequalities, marginalization, and human rights abuses in rural livelihoods, including specifically in MNC global value chains. As part of these efforts, we have also specifically invested in addressing gender-based exclusion, marginalization, and exploitation of labor. No doubt, these efforts have collided uncomfortably with the plantation logic as it grounds the post-colonial reality driving globalization to feed the world through an economic model of profit extraction and maximization for the wealthy, with a high cost of being absorbed by the people and environments it exploits. This dilemma led Oxfam to publicly launch the Make Trade Fair campaign in 2003 to focus on the rigged global trading system rife with double standards and structural inequalities. To complement campaigning, Oxfam supported fair trade initiatives working with partners and farming communities, for example, coffee and cotton. In regard to food security and rural livelihoods, the question for us at Oxfam has become one of how can societies organize the growing and processing of food and other plant-based and animal-based products for non-food purposes free of exploitation with the greatest inclusivity for all humanity to benefit? By benefit, we mean in terms of all people having access to sufficient nutritious food and to stable, viable livelihoods for generations to come. Our reflections here are based on the following case examples from Oxfam's work: tea workers in Assam, India; farm workers on tobacco plantations in North Carolina, United States; land and livelihood dispossession for smallholder farmers in Brazil; palm oil plantations and asparagus export production in Peru; smallholder cocoa farming in Ghana; fair partnerships in palm oil, and system of rice intensification in Vietnam and Cambodia. For the interest of time, I will not have time to actually go into the details of these case examples, but we can take those up in the Q&A later. So what is the problem? As we reflect here, we think the answer to our guiding question evades us for two core reasons. Firstly, of all humanity does not share universal values of inclusion, equality, or equity and cooperation. Secondly, and relatedly, the diversity of competing perspectives, both in terms of the above and even within a most abstract paradigm that embraces values of inclusion, equality, and cooperation, inevitably makes land, access, control, and use an ongoing site of struggle. In our programmatic work, we no doubt see the drive for efficiency, scale, and profit maximization in the global economy, the organizing principles of the plantation logic, which is beyond the agriculture and food sectors to industries of natural resource extraction, often pitting extraction operations in conflict with smallholder farmers at the site of extraction. The persistent and frustrating challenge is how to engage with such unequal social dynamics in a global political economic system. Accumulation of land as an asset has always featured in the plantation model. However, revived interest in land concentration by old landowners and new investors alike have surfaced even in places that have undergone a period of land and agrarian reform. Foreign capital from investment funds spurred by corporate consolidation in the agriculture food sector is fueling new and expanded initiatives involving plantation agriculture. Land is a central asset. There is a finite amount of land to claim for agricultural purposes, and thus by definition constitutes a site for potential social struggle, both within and with the plantation economy. Communities, farmers, and specifically women have insecure land rights. Land is one of the very few assets that they can own, access through communal institutional arrangements, or acquire user rights and state-owned arrangements. But often land is not well protected against the attention of investors, vertical integrators, and governments looking to grant concessions. Smallholders who produce agricultural commodities, including for global value chains, are squeezed in the middle between retailers, food and beverage companies, and agribusinesses on the one hand, and input companies on the other, seeking constant return on investment, cost reduction, and efficiencies. These powerful multinational corporations control huge shares of commodity markets, leaving smallholder farmers with little choice in the marketplace to sell their product. The companies control terms of sale, including quality, price, quantity, and time, with farmers having little negotiating power. Given this, the plantation logic presents a conundrum for corporate actors in global agricultural value chains, seeking to respond to resistance to plantation operations and calls and struggle for change, namely reconciling the two sets of organizing principles. At the same time, the plantation logic drives additionally a set of core challenges characterizing the food systems today. So what are the challenges we see in our work? First, hunger and food insecurity persists. The plantation model paradox has failed to deliver food security for all. Ironically, it can tie high levels of hunger and food insecurity to rural areas. Destruction of the social fabric, that is culture and identity, of peasant who are mostly rural and small farmer communities. Livelihood security, which is migration to plantation and the cycle of livelihood exploitation for families. Climate change. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported that 23% of GHG emissions come from agriculture, forestry, and related land use, including from deforestation driven by industrial agriculture, peatland degradation, and from fertilizers and large-scale agriculture and livestock production methods. Sustainability of land, which is soil degradation, and water quantity and quality are outcomes of input-intensive plantation model. Land ownership, rights, access, and control tied to issues of food and livelihood security. Ongoing feminization of labor in the context of gendered marginalization, segregation, and exploitation of labor in agriculture. And finally, increased labor precarity and loss of stability, especially among seasonal and temporary workers. So how is Oxfam trying to disrupt this plantation logic and stimulate alternatives? We try and do that by focusing on systemic issues, need for new business models developed in cooperation and grounded in values of inclusion and equity. Oxfam is working in partnership with others to fortify the resilience of smallholder farming and holistically address the challenges faced by rural communities. We see the need to address the power in global supply chains by engaging big MNCs to respect human rights, which is land, worker, gender, etc., and do so within planetary boundaries. Second, engage governments to invest in local food systems and smallholder farming, land and gender rights, and act on climate. Third, address social norms that leave women and other vulnerable populations from accessing opportunities in the food system. And finally, support food and entrepreneurs that are leading the way in building a new food system, one that is inclusive, diverse, and meets the needs of communities. We are contributing to new production models that incorporate these dimensions of change. Examples include the FAIR partnership in palm oil and the system of rice intensification. Bringing about a transformation in agricultural models is a monumental endeavor that requires political will. What is the incentive for the political or economic class to change the current system? One of Oxfam's approaches has been to advocate for human rights for all in the political economic systems, arguing that market-based, profit-driven models of producing food should not threaten or even be at odds with the well-being of all people. But there are other arguments that Oxfam uses as well. For instance, the plantation model is a driver of economic and social inequality, which is bad for economies. It is also a driver of climate change, which is bad even for agriculture, for economies, and for humanity. Our advocacy and campaigning approaches are grounded in a different understanding of scale that attempts to address structural inequalities and marginalization in food systems in the globalized economy through more inclusive public policy and regulation of corporations and finance. Through these approaches, we also seek to contribute to the reshaping of intellectual paradigms, driving economic development and agricultural investment. More inclusive and equitable food production in cooperative ways that meet all people's basic needs is grounded in respect for all people's rights to dignity and voice in their own destiny, and is environmentally sustainable, requires moving away from exploitative plantation model. Companies and investors must recognize that their current business models that are grounded in a plantation logic of exploitation of people as labor and of the environment as the natural resources is in food production for primarily short-term profit extraction and maximization are unacceptably harmful to people and the environment. They will need to embrace more holistic business models that internalize social and environmental impacts and performance and give women, farmers, workers, and communities voice, fair value, and enable retention of their resources and the planet's health. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these really rich remarks. Now we move on to comments by Dr. Carla Gras.
Thank you, everyone. My presentation draws on my research on soy production in Argentina, which has been the star crop of the country's massive agricultural growth for the last 3 decades and has led to a renewed centrality of large-scale agriculture. And so I would like to share some findings which I hope will contribute to the discussion. To this end, I will consider the differences between the Pampa region, a historically integrated to commodity world markets, and the Chaco region, where commodity frontiers have rapidly expanded since in the last 4 decades. Large export-oriented agriculture in Argentina cannot be assimilated to the plantation system in the present or in the past. But as plantations, it has shaped persistent structures of exclusion and inequality. It has been the subject of intense debates since the country's organization as a nation in the early 90s, following European control rule. Debates discussed on the role of a landed elite very early integrated into commodity world markets in the country's economic and social development, Debates also address the consequences of the economic and political power of this elite in the unequal and subordinated integration of different regions of Argentina to this agro-export model of development. Jumping over the century, more recently, large-scale export-oriented agriculture has come again in the hotspot of political and academic agendas. In different articles, I have discussed the idea that current large-scale agriculture is still dominated by the members of that old elite. On the contrary, those traditional families are barely present in the dome of large-scale agriculture today, as also showed by the work of Miguel Murmis in the Canadian Journal of Development Studies. My research on large-scale agricultural firms in Argentina also shows that the control over large tracts of land is not exclusively, nor mainly based on ownership, but on an array combination of mechanisms which include land leasing and other arrangements as those that organize the so-called sowing pools. They also control labor and large amounts of capital throughout sourcing and third parties asset management schemes, as usually called in the jargon of the agribusiness spokesman. These diverse ways in which large-scale firms access to and control land, capital, and labor, as well as how they organize production, are very significant features when analyzing the implications of large-scale agriculture. I think that we need to consider the heterogeneous forms that characterize large-scale agriculture in our discussions. Also, this diversity has different expressions and implications, for example, in two areas with very different socio-productive and agroecological characteristics. As I said, the Pampa region in the case of Argentina and the Chaco region. In the rich and fertile Pampa region, the existence of medium and large-scale capitalist firms, capitalized family farming, and machinery contractors shape specific concentration and integration paths. I should mention that according to the last two national agricultural census between 1988 and 2002, the total number of farmers decreased 23%. That amounts to nearly 7,100 farms. But in the Pampa region, this decrease amounts to 28% and is mainly concentrated in small-sized units. Those under 200 hectares where we mainly find capitalist family farming. As I found in my research, there are two major trajectories for these opted out farmers. On the one hand, what other colleagues like as Ben McKay and Gonzalo Colque have called, in the case of Bolivia, productive exclusion. That is, farmers that are excluded from production but keep their land, which they lease out, reaping benefits through land rates. On the other hand, ex-farmers that have kept their machinery and turned to offer machinery services. Contractors usually work for a number of permanent clients, including situations where they only work for one, as it is the case of large-scale firms. Two features should be underlined here. First, the social origin, which differentiates them from rural workers in terms of class. They are descendants from European settlers. Second, they have no wage relationship with firms that buy their services, and they play a key part in the organization of production. In addition, for many remaining small-sized farms, continuously squeezed by competition for land and the need to increase scale, this pathway is seen as a viable opting-out alternative. Within these trajectories, relationships between small and large-scale agriculture are built under a sort of what we can describe as de facto solidarities. These have not only hampered contestation, but more significantly but more important, have been significant factors in the hegemonic construction of the agribusiness model in Argentina. It is worth also highlighting that contestation in the Pampa region has mainly involved urban populations living in the surrounding cities and localities, mainly concerned with diseases and other health problems caused by sprayings. More than often, demands for regulation of these practices have not entailed wider questionings on large-scale agriculture. However, they have associated these health problems to the use of agrotoxins. Farmers that live in these towns, usually small or medium scale, are the visible faces of these sufferings. They too are their neighbors, their friends, and even their relatives. Contestation have had to deal with this micro-social level of social relationships. In addition, the fact that they are focused on the use of agrotoxins and even in the has been exploited, by hegemonic responses based on agricultural good practices. The crisis of traditional small-scale farmers organizations who have been caught in between the logics of the agribusiness model are also part of this landscape. I should also mention that the spillover legitimization discourse works well in the Pampa region, and this is not a mere reflection of the power of agribusiness, since though unequally distributed, export commodity production has to some extent mobilized local economies. The landscape is totally different in the Chaco region, where large-scale agriculture also expanded and this is a region where soils and climate conditions are less suitable for agriculture and where peasant-like farming has historically characterized agrarian structures. The expansion of export commodity production into this region triggered deforestation, land use changes, dispossessions, evictions, and enclosures. Extra-regional capitals and local political and economic elites grab land, frequently through not very legal means. Conflicts here are widespread, many times involving violence. Here, the expansion of large-scale agriculture has not been accompanied by an increase in the demand of workers. Local machinery contractors face competition from those coming from the Pampa region. Also, digital agriculture is being incorporated, since resistant weeds and plagues are particularly extended in this region, and also due to soil and climate conditions, yields are significantly lower than in the Pampa regions, and profit margins are therefore narrower. As showed, at least in the case of Argentina, labor regimes associated to the expansion of large-scale agriculture are characterized by the exclusion of workers in agricultural production, with increasing levels of intermittence and precariousness. Rural workers and peasants whose subsistence relied on wage relationships find the already small and precarious niches to subsist even smaller and more precarious. To finish, I would like to stress 3 points that I try to make in my presentations. In the first place, the importance of considering the heterogeneity of large-scale agriculture, which not only has to do with the amounts of capital and land it controls, but also how this control is achieved and maintained over the time. In the second place, the need to pay attention to how relationships with outsourced workers and small growers, as observed in the Pampa region, may be significantly worked to help restore and legitimate ideals and discourses on development and modernization associated to large-scale agriculture. In the case of Argentina, these ideals and discourses are deeply rooted in the idea that development, as understood as mainly economic, can only come from the integration to global markets. Of course, if we consider that 28% of Argentina's total exports by value come from the soy complex, the idea is self-confirmed. And in fact, alternative models are confronted with the question of how could development be achieved without the green gold of soy and other commodities. And the third point would be the need of integrating the role of technological changes in the shaping of labor regimes, including its impacts on the amount of workers and working conditions, and its connections to issues regarding the production of marginalized masses of labor whose unstable conditions of subsistence are increasingly worsened by the intermittence and precariousness of their connections to labor markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have a talk from Dr. Shalmali Guttal.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? All right. Okay. Thank you. So thank you, everybody, and thank you to the organizers of this conference. I'm calling in from India, where COVID is raging to unprecedented levels. But I guess I won't even go in that direction because that's another whole story altogether. So like June and others, I've also written my notes down to save time. So I'll jump right into it. And I can see Jack on the corner of the screen as I'm reading. So when you hold up your sign, I'll be able to follow it. So my main arguments are on that first, the territorially embedded local, national, regional food systems, spaces that are inhabited by smallholders and rural and urban workers. They have been and will continue to be crucial spaces for resistance and alternatives to the plantation economy model, which I will refer to in my talk today as corporate agriculture. And I said local, national, regional food systems because local and localness and locality itself can, the scale of this terminology really varies. It's quite relative depending on which region or which country one is located in. But the importance here is the embeddedness, the territorial embeddedness. So, what is very local in India could be as large as regional in Laos or Burma and so on and so forth. Now, such food systems are socially, culturally, economically, environmentally, biologically, and politically diverse. And an abundance of experience shows that these are the food systems that sustain the majority of the world's peoples, especially in the face of deepening climate change, pandemics, and economic and financial crises. More generally, food systems embody the relationships that people and communities have with their ecologies. They're spaces where social relations and knowledge are shaped. They're pillars of domestic economies and the source of livelihoods for large segments of our populations in the South. Food sovereignty, agroecology, defense of land and territories, rights of access to land and ecosystems, workers' rights, locally organized cooperatives and enterprises, and territorial markets, all of these, which are referred to as alternatives, but are actually the daily systems operated and practiced by the people who inhabit these local territorially embedded systems. These have emerged from and are being refined by food system actors that inhabit these spaces. And the COVID-19 pandemic has catalyzed communities, small-scale food producers and workers all over the world to link their actions, revitalize mutual help initiatives, and build new solidarities. And we have done, along with other members in the social movements and civil society organizations engaging in food systems, on documenting how small-scale food producers and workers have fared under COVID, and that those I can share those links with people later. Now, the second argument here I make is that corporations covet, they desire these food systems. The very existence of territorially embedded food systems are a threat to the existence of corporate food systems and corporate agriculture, because the existence of corporate agriculture is dependent on capturing and disrupting the actors, elements, and processes of these territorially embedded food systems, simplifying their complexities to a model that is more easily legible to capitalism and that enables alienation of people, work, nature, and location, which we would call globalized supply chains very often, is central to the expansion of corporate agriculture. Also important is then universalizing corporate agriculture model through technologies, finance, and governance and discourse, which is what I refer to as the corporate capture of food systems in the application of the plantation. Ooh, that's a mouthful. Now, uniformity is important for a globalized corporate food system to work. But how do you bring this about? The world has so many food systems that are linked, that overlap. Many have existed for generations. Many come up in response to crises and unanticipated conditions, displacement, resettlement, etc. Even in places with communities that have been displaced and resettled multiple times by large dams or infrastructure projects, local systems develop, which then threaten the corporate system. So this is where the imposition of control over different strands and aspects of food systems becomes very important and strategic. And this type of control is both material and ideological. Now, corporate presence and corporate power and the influence in the food and agriculture sector is not a new phenomenon. Private companies have been involved in financing, producing, and trading agricultural commodities for at least 300 years, longer. But since the mid-20th century, we've seen that corporate presence in various sectors, not only food and agriculture, but this has expanded considerably across the world, enabled by neoliberal policies, strengthened by trade investment agreements, secured by governance regimes, and promoted as necessary and desirable through multi-stakeholder initiatives. State disinvestment in public sectors, privatization, public-private partnerships, the PPPs, deregulation, and pro-corporate regulation have blurred the lines between direct and indirect corporate operations. And corporations have become powerful actors in shaping public policy and also articulations of what constitutes public interest. Now, when I say corporate capture, it's not only corporations that are doing the capturing, but corporate capture includes a growing ecosystem of actors aligned with, dependent on, and or benefiting from the economic model that corporations promote. I'm getting some feedback, Jack. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
I'm
fine.
getting a strange echo.
If someone else is not muted, please do mute yourself.
Now, thanks, Jack. Now, areas where corporate capture is very easily visible, they include agricultural inputs, equipment markets, control over land and territories, food, agriculture, supply value chains, transportation and distribution, knowledge, technology, and so on. But I would like to focus here on the issue of governance and regulatory influence and or capture, because we see that a very important aspect of corporate capture and corporate control is the capture of laws, regulations, policies, and so on, investor protection. And less visibly, but equally important, is how corporations build public and social support for their model. They use numerous channels to present themselves as necessary positive force in addressing hunger, food insecurity, poverty, health, climate change, and so on. They use press, media, and PR firms to present their narratives to the public. They finance policy think tanks, education programs, academic institutions, civil society organizations, local initiatives, public spaces programs through corporate social responsibility. And this is part of the larger ecosystem of corporate capture, because it's not only the corporations, but the number of different entities that are allied and benefit and are dependent on them. And very important here are the public-private partnership models with governments. As governments disinvest, corporations take over financing of critical elements of public spaces and processes, and also multi-stakeholder processes and multi-stakeholder initiatives. And here now I'd like to move to a particular part of multi-stakeholderism and corporate capture of governance, which is the increasing corporate presence in global governance through multi-stakeholder initiatives and strategic partnerships. Through these, corporations have entered the arenas of global governance since a very long time. But of course, the kind of multi-stakeholder initiatives we see today, or that have grown over the last 10, 15 years, are quite particular. They use both public and private financing. They involve governments, UN bodies, corporations, corporate philanthropies, academic institutions, civil societies, and so on. They offer technical assistance to governments, to public bodies, They commission and monitor research. They generate so-called evidence for policymaking. They set standards, they implement programs, and so on. But eventually, all of these are oriented towards market-based economies. What I'd like to say in my last 1 minute, because I've, as usual, put too much information in here, is that a particularly, I think, important aspect of corporate capture is what we are seeing is the relationship between the World Economic Forum and the United Nations system. So in 2019, the World Economic Forum and the United Nations system signed a strategic partnership agreement. A few months after that, the United Nations Secretary General announced plan for a UN Food System Summit in 2021. Now, if we look at the World Economic Forum, the World Economic Forum is in many ways, it's a stellar example of the way discourse and narratives come together in one place to blend with the power of finance, the power of technology, and the power of other political influence, to cement corporate control. So I won't go into, you can all go to those of you who are not familiar with the WEF food and agriculture systems, you can go to their website and see what they're up to. But what's interesting about the Food System Summit, I think the UN Food System Summit sits very well in the application of the plantation no scene concept of food systems. It's a complex example, but if we look at the way and the Food Systems Summit is being organized, the aim of the summit, as stated in an information note, is to provide a key contribution to the decade of action. It has all the right, it has all the right language in terms of sustainable development goals, actionable commitments to make food systems sustainable, climate adapted, resilient, and so on. But if we look at the structure of organizing, and if we look at the kinds of proposals that are coming up, and those who are the advocates and the leaders, the public leaders of the UN Food System Summit, they're all from the corporate world. They are part of the plantation economy. They are the plantation economy. So the special envoy of the Secretary General Special Envoy for the Food System Summit is Agnes Kalibata, who's the president of the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa. This signals clearly the UN support of Agra's market-led technology-driven approach, as well as an affirmation of the kind of philanthropic capitalist framework of Agra. And this is what is being, this approach is being globalized through the UN Food System Summit. And I think, the current involvement of the World Economic Forum in the organization of the summit has to be understood as one piece of a broader corporate strategy to capture the broadest possible regulatory governance spaces, which would have the power to allow the local, more territorially grounded food systems to survive. So in this is a battle where there's a very strategic move to capture politics and finance and decision making over how food systems that are territorially embedded with the local, national, and regional levels are going to be governed, and what spaces they will have in the future. And in response to this, hundreds of social movements and civil society organizations and academic scientists have taken an extremely critical position against the UN Food System Summit. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that, despite successes of corporate capture and control efforts, territorially embedded food systems continue to live. Their protagonists and their central actors adapt to threats and they reorganize. They put down new roots and branches by building place-based collectives and cross-place, cross-identity alliances. But to be clear, these food systems are not necessarily clearly delineated and articulated, nor are they necessarily self-sustaining. They're not necessarily just equal, environmentally friendly. They're not ideal systems. They are ridden with internal contradictions. They're not free of racism necessarily, or classism, or social class, gender class inequalities, etc. But they offer the possibility of autonomy and self-organization that is critical for challenging corporate capture over the world's food systems. The corporate capture language and narratives, as we see in the UN Food Systems narratives, and in the World Economic Forum narratives that's there on its that's that's articulated in its website and all its publications, does not actually recognize its own contradictions, nor does it recognize the way it limits possibilities for diversity. So you have, an ideal, a system that's presenting itself as an ideal, seeking to bring into its fold, to uniformize a bunch, a very large plethora of diverse systems that have already recognized themselves that they're internally not ideal. So this is a longer working process that we're engaged in, and I'll be happy to share more information in the future. Thank you.
And thank you so much. Now we finish with Dr. Prabhu Pingali.
Thank you, Jack. Greetings, everyone from Ithaca. It's kind of a dreadful day here today. It's snowing in the middle of April, so we're not in a great mood here. But I'm delighted to be here and to participate in this discussion. I did have a set of slides, but since no one has shown slides, I'm not going to do so either. But I will be happy to contribute my slides to the organizers and they can post it later. I'd like to thank Wendy for inviting me to be part of this session. I'm an agricultural economist, and so that's kind of different from other members of this panel. I'm also a strong believer in markets and a strong believer in globalization, so that also may put me in a different situation from others on this panel. But what I'd like to do today is talk about plantation agriculture in India and talk about both a historical perspective on plantations in India and where they are and what are the prospects for improving the overall economics and livelihood of plantation holders, farmers, plantation workers, etc. So that's what I'd like to do. Let me start by saying that the plantation sector in India, relative to the overall agriculture sector, is quite small, but it's still a major sector in terms of export orientation and export earnings, etc. And the three big plantation crops in India, tea, rubber, coffee, these are very important crops globally, and they're important export earnings for India, but they're also very important within the country. India is one of the largest consumers of tea, a very large consumer of rubber and coffee, etc. But what's striking to me is when I look at the history of these crops in India, these crops have essentially been around in terms of intensive plantation cultivation only in the last 150 or so years. And so it's been intriguing to me to see how did we get here. And of course, as most of you know, much of this history of plantations and the introduction of plantation crops into India and elsewhere came through our colonial heritage and came through the British bringing much of these crops into India and into other parts of Asia and Latin America and Africa. But when I look back, when you think about the early trading that happened with the British in India, the early trading was actually in spices. So that's how much of the trade started and much of the commercial connections between Indian agriculture and the outside world came in. And that's not surprising. I mean, the whole idea of trade routes to India came because of bringing in spices into the European market. And at that time, coffee, tea, rubber, etc., were not big crops. At that time, I'm talking around in the late 1700s, early 1800s, Brazil dominated rubber, China dominated tea, North Africa dominated coffee. And it was only towards the mid-1800s that you began to see the change happening. You began to see these crops moving into South Asia, to India and Southeast Asia. How did this happen? It happened due to a set of factors that came together. The Suez Canal opened up, and the telegraph, landline telegraph opened up, connecting India to Europe. And at the same time, there was massive investments that took place in plant sciences. And the Royal Botanical Garden in England became a major center of research on plantation agriculture. And rubber is a great example of that. Rubber, as you know, is native to Brazil and to the Amazon. A few years ago, I was on a tour on that in the Amazon, and I went along the Amazon River. And my tour started in Manaus. And for the first time, I learned something about rubber. What I learned about rubber was that rubber was not only just native to the Amazon, it was growing wild in the Amazon. It wasn't grown as a plantation crop. It was grown as a wild crop. And tribal populations would sap the trees and collect the rubber and bring it into Manaus town, from which it was exported out to other parts of the world. So Manaus became this major boom town with beautiful buildings, a great opera, etc. But when I visited Manaus in 2015, 2016, it was like a ghost town. The opera house, everything was gone, was pretty much dilapidated, etc. What happened? What happened was some of the British explorers that came in got the plant material from the native rubber that was growing wild and brought it to the Kew Gardens in London, where they standardized it, they improved the quality of it, they improved the productivity of it and reproducibility of the crop, and then brought that improved material to India, to Malaysia, to Indonesia, etc. And over time, Brazil lost its ability to continue to be a world leader on rubber. And that's how the whole change happened. Of course, then Brazil gained from coffee, because the same process brought coffee from North Africa to India and also to Brazil. And so these kinds of changes happen due to massive improvements in plant sciences that took place, and at the same time, massive improvements in global trade and connectivity that happened. Tea came in because of the opium wars that were happening with China, and that brought tea in. And so eventually you had India becoming a major partner in this whole plantation agriculture. But over time, you began to notice that much of the production that was happening in India in plantation agriculture was being done by small farmers. It was being done by farmers who have less than 2 hectares of land. And that's 90% of the plantation agriculture in India. And what that meant was these farmers, although the product was globally connected, they were not benefiting much from that. They were not benefiting in terms of prices, because whenever the market prices were low, that was transmitted directly to the farmers. Whereas when the prices were high, the higher price was not transmitted. And that was primarily because there were very few buyers and millions of farmers that were trying to access these buyers and the market. And so they were not politically powerful, they were not economically powerful. And because they were tribal and ethnic communities, they were not connected to the mainstream institutions that could give them support, etc. And that's been a primary problem that's been in existence within the Indian plantation community for quite some time now. Now, where do we go from here? You have a set of plantation farmers who are tied into this crop primarily because of the investments that they've made, and there's no way to get out of it because of the long time period it takes to build up these plantations. So diversification out is quite difficult. So there are only two options to look at. One option is to move out, and you find that many of the younger generation within these plantation communities are getting educated, moving off the farm, moving into urban areas, etc. But the second way to look at the future is to move up. And the way one moves up is to create aggregation models around smallholders. And that's an area that my group is doing a lot of work on, looking at how do you create farmer aggregation models such as farmer producer organization, farmer cooperatives, etc. And by doing that, you create the strength, you create economic strength, and you create political strength and social strength, and you improve overall bargaining power in order to get maximize prices and also better access to inputs, better access to technologies, etc. We've been looking at different models of farmer producer organizations and success stories around that. And there are many in the plantation sector. There's really good examples of how coffee and tea plantations in Africa have, through producer organizations and through cooperatives, have been able to create a brand for themselves and create a niche market around the products, such as the Kenya tea or the Ethiopian coffee, etc., where rather than selling it as a bulk product, you sell it as a branded product. And that's made a big difference. And you've seen similar shade-grown coffee coming out of Central America, etc., that because you create that aggregation, you have the power to capture some of the market. There's a lot of effort that's also been going on fair trade and sustainability certifications, etc., that are designed to strengthen smallholder production systems. But the success of these programs also depends on the ability of farmers to form cooperatives, to form producer organizations, etc. And creating that scale also allows you to minimize some of the risks associated with price movements that are happening. So once you have the scale, you have the ability to be part of a futures market. You have the ability to sell your product forward. You have the ability to access credit, etc., and thereby improve the stability of your production system, stability of your incomes, and also improve overall income and food security as you look forward. But I think the final point I want to make is, as you create an aggregation model, as you create a way in which you work as a group, the political strength that comes out of it also is important, because then that allows you to create better opportunities to bring in administrative reforms, policy reforms that can then help longer term sustainability of the sector. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks to all of our presenters for these really, really great insights. So now we will move into the question and answer portion of the meeting. We have a number of items coming up in the chat. And so if you want to add a question in the chat, please start by writing question in caps, so it's easier for me to identify your question and bring those in. Also, if you'd like to use the raise hand function in Zoom, you can go over to the bottom the bottom menu and go to the reactions button and hit the raise hand button that comes up above that. I will try and keep track of people who raise their hands and would like to ask their questions in person, and I'll ask you to unmute and share your video so that you can ask your question yourself. Looking to see if there are any hands up to start out the conversation. Otherwise, I'll start with a point from the, we do have a hand up from Francisco. Please unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I want to ask about to Jun Borras and Carla Gras. It's about Jun was talking about the limits of the struggle against the plantation when it happens within the plantation, and Carla was talking about the different shape of the work of plantation in Argentina. So I was wondering if you could talk about agricultural workers living and working in camps inside plantation, and how it worked, these limits of private property as an obstacle to that organization trying to fight against this type of plantation, people living and working in awful camps inside the plantation. If you can talk about that topic. Thank you.
So we can answer now? Okay. The one thing that is that I have seen in the case of, at least in Argentina, is that you have to consider the issue of the outsourcing of different tasks. So something that many people have studied here is that who is hiring. The wage relationship is so diffuse, because the ones who recruit workers are contractors, and they work in different farms or plots, and workers many times do not know exactly for where they are working or who is their boss, to say it, su patron. Their relationship is with the contractor. And so this is a very significant feature to for your question. And the other thing is that this relationship with contractors, it is barely, for many workers, it is a seasonal relationship. There are very few workers who are permanent workers. And so, for example, and with this I finish, we saw during the pandemic last year that many workers that were recruited for with contractors or directly by farmers ended their work, and they had no protection, no help to go back to their homes. You see, because the relationship is intermittent, as I was pointing out, and very precarious, including workers that are recruited by contractors. So I think that this is a very significant issue to bear in mind.
There are actually two questions that raise similar themes, so I think I'm going to combine them. One comes from Tanya Lee, and another from a person labeled Haro. And From Shalmali and Jun's presentations, we see that corporate agriculture is fundamentally incompatible with embedded food systems, ag justice, livelihoods. From Diya, we see Oxfam's attempts to work with corporations to tame them and make them attend to human rights. And as Carla shows, they sometimes have to buy in, have local buy-in and support. Then we see Prabhu Pingali's presentation about aggregation models. In many smallholder plantation schemes, smallholders are tied to central buying and processing companies with delivery contracts, input contracts, and or leases, and so on, with other kinds of complicated relationships with corporations. And so the question is, the questions that come out of these observations are: does aggregation include detachment from plantation companies? Is this about taming corporations or a need to bring them down, or perhaps some other combination of the approaches that Jun spoke about? So we've got these questions go to just about everybody. So it's a great chance, I think, for everyone, as you wish, to join in and see where you come in part of the conversation. Shalmali, perhaps would you like to start?
Okay. Well, in my view, I don't think corporations can be tamed. I mean, if you look at, corporate social responsibility and the multi-stakeholder initiatives and the UN Global Compact and all these different public-private partnerships that have come up, globally and even nationally and regionally, where corporations are somehow being encouraged to centralize some types of human rights and sustainable and social equity and justice goals. Eventually, what happens is that the changes that they make are cosmetic, and in the absence of strong enforceable laws and regulations and public interest oriented regulations which are enforceable on corporations and corporate operations, in the absence of those, whatever changes corporations make are usually they're usually cosmetic. So I don't think they can be tamed. Now, can they be brought down? That's another huge question, because I'm not sure that that's entirely possible either in and of itself. But I think what Prabhu pointed out is definitely a way in which those who inhabit these different territorially embedded spaces across the world, they're coming up with their own strategies of figuring out how to use the market and how to deal with the market. And I think, organizing the way I'm seeing it today, and we just had some very interesting meetings in the last few weeks of what's happening in India in terms of corporate power on one hand and state power on the other, et cetera, is that smallholders and workers themselves are figuring out different ways in which they can move away from extreme models of state control and corporate control. So what are the different forms of economic governance and economic agency that people can take on and build alliances and move on there? So we're seeing lots of new ideas, different types of ideas coming up for cooperatives, for setting up worker-based food systems and so on. I'll stop here. I don't want to take it to the next phase.
Would any of the other speakers like to follow up on that question? Yes, Prabhu.
Yeah, I'd like to just follow up. I think, if you take a commodity like coffee, there are basically 10 companies that process and trade in coffee globally. And that's why you can have your coffee in the morning for cheap, right? That's the trade-off. And you're never going to be able to match that price point by having individualized delivery from niche operations. I can go in and buy Ethiopian coffee, but I'm paying 4 or 5 times the price I pay for just a regular supermarket branded coffee. And that's the difference. So the question to me is, and in that reality, how do you improve the lives of smallholders who depend on these global value chains? And I think aggregation models help you in several ways. They help you improve your bargaining power. And by having a strong producer organization, you're able to negotiate a better price relative to an individual farmer trying to do that on their own. So that's, I think, one of the biggest advantages of having a producer organization. And then, of course, once you have the producer organization, you can create scale within the organization. And so you can build an infrastructure for processing and for value addition and creating opportunities for being able to sell not just the basic commodity, but to sell a value-added commodity. And that then improves the price point, and it also improves the long-term sustainability of the operation. So I think that's the way I would look at it, rather than to say corporations or no corporations.
Yes, Diya.
Yeah, thanks. In terms of the question posed for Oxfam's engagement with corporates, and in some ways, I think Jun also kind of referred to that, is that it's not a question of tame or eliminate. It's by engaging in taming, resisting, escaping, and trying to smash all of this is, it's a composite which kind of brings about important changes, which is how we look at it. And then also the question of, if you look in terms of agro-industrial workers and their demands are for better wages or better working conditions, not really in terms of questioning the system per se. So the whole question of elite capture is kind of important, that a complete overhaul of the existing political economy system of plantations is possibly not going to happen anytime soon. So how do you work through all the existing systems and its problems? That, instead of trying to completely and kind of idealistically say that it's all going to be overhauled, and actually engage with them and try and see if you can bring about incremental changes over time. Thanks.
Yeah, in the line of what my colleagues are saying, I would like to add that the big issue is in the meantime, no? And for example, in Latin America, the thing that we see is that this, for example, corporate social responsibility schemes and so on, in some small towns or in some areas, they put money for social assistance or for repairing schools and so on. They have a bigger budget than those that the local authorities have. And so this is something that we should also bear in mind. How the states also are positioned in this before this corporate power.
All right. And now we have Jun back. Jun, did you want to follow up on the question, the question that was asked earlier?
Do we have a sound now?
Yes.
Oh, good. It always happens, and my laptop is even new. I left with a question about workers inside the plantation and what to do with them. And with Carla. I thought that it's nothing unique to agricultural workers living in the plantation. It's a more generalized condition for labor under neoliberal global capitalism, in which, as Carla emphasized in her input, it's a condition of casualized, precarious condition for work. So but the political impact of that is terrible, because it weakens a lot the very logic and the very reason for the weakening of trade union movements all over the world during a neoliberalism. Is the same reason for a very weak kind of labor organizing within plantations, and even more so with the proliferation of seasonal migrant workers. There are two in my own world, in my own work for the last 30 years in the Philippines, in plantations, is that there are two kind of things on what to do with the workers within the plantation in terms of a struggle. So one is very much agrarian kind of oriented struggles, in which sugarcane plantation workers within sugarcane plantations, they struggle to gain land. And so once they gain land, the trajectory is to convert those who were for generations were plantation sugarcane cutters, plantation workers, into suddenly and overnight smallholder farmers. And almost always the outcome has been very unsatisfactory for all the advocates of agrarian justice. So almost always, most of those lands reverted back to the old landowners or to new landowning elites. Almost always, the farmers are unable to transition into small-scale farmers, and they reverted back to becoming sugarcane cutters. The other one is where, in my work in the southern plantation belt in the southern Philippines, banana plantation and pineapple plantation, in which many of these plantations were redistributed through land reform in the Philippines. The elite labor leaders, or what we call the labor aristocrats, took over and presided over a new regime in which they are now the owner-operators of land. So from labor aristocrats, they reinvented themselves into cooperative elites. And so they built multi-million-dollar kind of cooperatives. So rich cooperatives, very poor members. So, but then the plantation setup and the plantation logic were never dismantled. So those are two very polarized and very unpromising kind of trajectories of what is a post-plantation logic, what is a post-plantation possibilities. Easier said than done in real life, in contemporary settings. So probably a positive future for workers inside plantation still are not existing in a very common kind of way. Maybe it is something to be imagined and to be constructed. And I think that's one reason why we are all here having this kind of conversation.
I saw a hand up just before Jun started talking, and does that person still want to ask their question? If not, so I'm going to start with questions that are that are posed towards several or all of the presenters, and then I'll move, if we have time, to some of the more specific questions about individual talks. I'll start with one that was posed to Jun, but I think everybody would have something to say about. And so they write, I'm wondering if you could add a few comments or thoughts related to political and academic struggles about nature and environment beyond these labor and land issues related to peasants and rural production.
Well, Sergio wants to complicate it even further. I was already a little bit worried about the very complicated labor justice and agrarian justice. Now he wants to bring in ecological justice here. I think one of those who just put in a question in the chat box, Alisa Paredes, who does brilliant work in southern Philippines plantation belt on ecological issues in plantations maybe can actually join in the discussion and tell us more about what happens when we complicate it, when we bring environmental and ecological issues in the conversation. I don't know. I'm also very at a loss, and I'm not the whole trade union workers issues. Sometimes they pick up on issues of ecological matters in order to serve the purpose of their workers' struggles. So workers' compensation for contamination, for instance, but less about ecological justice kind of struggles. So those are two very different kind of things. So my own work is more into like ecological issues, including question of poisoning and contamination, are being subsumed in labor justice struggles, but not on a standalone ecological justice kind of issues of deforestation, contamination, pollution, and so on and so forth. In my own work in the Philippines, these are all ecological advocacy group, trade union workers group, agrarian justice worker groups. They operate in separate worlds. The only thing historically and in places that I know in which many of these sectoral and localized forms of struggles have been put into much more kind of coherent coalitional force are when there's a situation when there are very strong communist parties or socialist parties that aggregate these different sectoral kind of sometimes competing class interests into one unified political platform. But with the weakening of communist parties and socialist parties and other left-wing political parties to organize and aggregate those sectoral and localized struggles, what we saw is a very sectoral and localized kind of struggles on their own. What complicates the issue is that the era of NGOs even aggravated that already problematic situation because they basically replaced left-wing political parties in terms of immediate allies to these local struggles. And for NGOs, they love those sectoral and localized struggles, often resulting in institutionalizing petty reforms, rather than trying to bring up to a higher level of political unity to elevate local sectoral struggles into class struggles. Often what happens is that what goes into is these different groups go into the least common denominator, police harassment and others. Not that those are not important, those are important, but often at the expense of class-wise and system-wide kind of transformation. So I think I saw a chat box question there by Alisa. What then constitutes a genuine kind of resistance? For me, what constitutes resistance is that if there are very concrete manifestations of local struggles on the ground, but that are not isolated and scattered struggles, but are graduated into class struggle or class-wise, which means a system-wide kind of perspective to those struggles. That is very much missing now. And for me, there are different material bases for that and reasons for that. And one political reasons for that is the absence of political parties, usually communist and socialist parties, that try to aggregate and coalesce these kinds of localized struggles.
Thank you, Jun. Sorry, there are so many great questions coming through, and I'm doing my best to make tough choices in the few minutes we have remaining. I think I'd like to ask one question. So one person in the chat raised a question about online marketing, and I'd like to So they asked, do you think this alternative can deliver market access to smallholders and at the same time empower them? Or maybe what kinds of organizational and institutional approaches might be able to serve those purposes? Carla, would you be interested in starting off on that question?
I know nothing about it, but I will speculate. I think online marketing could help. The question is going to be how sustainable it is. Consumers are very fickle, right? Consumers are fickle. They go to one product today, tomorrow they're on to another product. So how do you create a long-term sustainable online presence? That's the big challenge. And I don't think we have long enough history to be able to answer this question. But that's the question that needs to be asked, whether you can create a presence that will sustain itself with consumer demand for a long period of time. And I'm not quite sure I know the answer to that. But Jack, since I have the mic, can I respond to one quick comment from Wendy about plant sciences and the connection to plantations? It's really interesting that plant sciences have had a phenomenal impact on food security around the world through improvements in crop breeding for staple grains, etc. But it's only now in this talk that I realized plant sciences had such a big impact on plantation agriculture. But when you look at who's doing the plant sciences for plantation agriculture, it's not the public sector. The public sector is very focused on food crops, whereas the private sector is the one that's invested in plantation agriculture crops, plantation crops. And so even if you try to create strengthened smallholders to take charge of plantation crops, their access to research and technology will be limited because much of that is concentrated in private sector, corporations, etc. And I think that's an area that needs to be studied further in terms of how do you improve access to new technologies, new methods, and all of that. That's my response to Wendy's question.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm afraid it is time for us to wrap up. I want to give thanks first to everybody who's attended. It's been a really great conversation in no small part due to the many comments and questions that are whirling about in the chat that I'm definitely going to save and look to and try and respond to more. And thanks to each of our presenters and to the organizers who put together this really lively conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for good facilitation, Jack.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Do we leave? What do we do?
I think we'll find it out there.
Jack, the next panel is opening at what time?
Oh, I believe at 11 o'clock. I'm sorry, I should have announced that.
That's okay, Jack. We'll put up a slide announcing the next panel. It'll start in about 15 minutes.
Okay. Hi, Wendy.
Hi. It's hard to coordinate these virtual conferences. Thanks, everyone.
Also, Wendy, agronomy? Really? I would say political ecology myself.